Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the first keynote speaker session for Masterclass 6 on feminism. I'm really glad to be here. It's a pleasure to be with you to speak on a topic really close to my work as well as my heart, media and the struggle for women's rights in Southeast Asia with a focus on Malaysia, where I'm based. So I thought we would perhaps start off with the historical context. So looking at the historical context, even though we want to be focusing on media, I think it's really important to ground it in an understanding of the country itself and how particularly women's rights, women's empowerment, how did this come into not only our everyday realizations, but as part of what the struggle is all about today. So looking at colonial Malaya and women's emancipation, it's really important to look at how the first documented usage of women's emancipation or women's liberation in Malaya was back in roughly 1920. Back then, it was a political and social project by male Malay Muslim reformers, some writers, including Syed Sheikh Al-Hadi, Zainal Abidin Ahmad, or better known as Zabah. So their advocacy back in 1920s emphasized on the education of women and girls, though through the fairly limited prism of equipping Malay women with the skills to fulfill their perceived primary role as educators of their children. In time, however, the dominant narrative of women's emancipation, it took on more intersectionality. Women from different ethnicities mobilized against anti-colonialism as well as to protest women's inferior status. And there were also, of course, in time, prominent radical women of the post-war years in Malaya between 1946 and 1948. These included when Malaya eventually gained political independence in 1957, both men and women actually already had the right to vote. So anyhow, though, to give a little quick perspective on how little top political leadership, at least in Malaysia, is sensitized to feminism and empowerment. In 2012, Malaysia's former Prime Minister Najib Razak, he actually declared, quote unquote, there is no need given from the start. I'll leave you to chew on that. From there, moving on into feminism in Malaysia. So fast forward to today, 2021, and what we have is a vibrant social justice movement across East as well as West Malaysia, and one that is increasingly diverse in representation of Malaysia's various ethnicities as well, which is very important. Malay, Indian, Chinese, indigenous, plus also women, Malaysian women in particular, advocating for refugee women and migrant women workers' rights. So this is especially true, I feel, when it comes to young women leading the way through their fledgling yet super impactful non-governmental organizations. Looking at a bigger picture, look at the recent success of Unpaid 18, which is translated as the right for 18-year-olds to vote in Malaysia, co-founded by a young woman, Kira Yusri. So Unpaid 18 has just been gazetted. It will take effect on December 15th, with implementation coming into place in January 2022. So not just speaking about women's rights, young women's rights, this actually empowers a rough figure of an average of 6 million Malaysians to potentially be able to vote if they're 18 and above by next year. Spearheaded, once again, by young women's efforts. So overall, though, the wider landscape of women's rights NGOs also forms one of Malaysian civil society's most active sectors. And when it comes to core issues, a lot of them are hereditary. A lot of them are those that, as we saw in the poll that Danny presented to us earlier, things that have been with us for decades, institutionalized sexism and discrimination. Domestic violence, of course, is an anchoring concern, as with all societies, not just in Southeast Asia, right? Women's Aid Organization in Malaysia, or WAO, founded in the mid-1980s. This was founded actually as a shelter for women and children seeking refuge from domestic violence. Today, of course, WAO has also proven instrumental in pushing for amendments to the Malaysian Employment Act to address pregnancy discrimination, ensure adequate paternal and maternal leave, as well as moving towards Malaysia having an anti-stalking bill. Besides that, violence against women naturally is another fundamental issue, spearheaded by NGOs like the All Women's Action Society, or AWAM. They've been pushing very hard for almost close to 20, 25 years for the tabling of Malaysia's sexual harassment bill They also work intensively in raising awareness around gender-based violence in general, such as rape culture and how it connects to women's rights. On the other hand, you've got other deep-seated issues. Child sexual abuse, and as we deem it here, child marriage is another issue. It also gained much more momentum in recent years because back in 2018, there was international coverage, condemnation about an 11-year-old marrying a 41-year-old man here in Malaysia. Same goes for the issues of period poverty, comprehensive sexuality education, teenage pregnancy, baby dumping, unequal citizenship laws, all of which have long been problematic in Malaysia, but have only recently been covered with any regularity in mainstream media. I do recall back when I first started off in the field of broadcast journalism around a decade ago, it was not only difficult to find spokespersons or NGOs or academics, etc., who worked in this arena, it was equally just as hard to get media slots or to have your editors approve these stories for publication or even for airing on TV. So yeah, we've come a long way from 10 years ago to today, right? But I also feel that the coverage of such marginalization issues has also increased steeply in the past 2 years. Primarily due to a lot more social media debates around it and also COVID-related prevalence. COVID-related prevalence, I feel also coincides with the fact that we do spend a lot more of our time online and digitalized, right? Just as we are now here, tuning into this masterclass online. Right. So moving on from there into women's political representation. Now, this brings us to why it's so difficult for women's rights, girls' rights to be framed as human rights violations and even being of critical importance to national development. Let's remain cognizant of these facts when it comes to Malaysia. And I do want you all listening in from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Malaysia, of course, and other countries to think about the makeup of your parliament, your national parliament. So when it comes to Malaysia, in 2018, the median age of Malaysian members of parliament was 55.5 years. Only 2 out of 222 MPs aged below 30. Also, we have 6 times more male than female MPs, or around 31 over 222 MPs. This falls way short of the 30% women in politics, which is globally acknowledged as being essential for fairer representation, reforms to be reflected in the corridors of power when you've got a 50% female population. So when you don't have this women's political participation, the fundamental prerequisite for gender equality, for genuine democracy, fails to be met. And this is something which cuts across our borders when we look at ASEAN. So if you do not have female policymakers facilitating women's direct engagement in public decision making, there is no real means of ensuring better accountability for women. This democratic deficit, of course, results in lack of equal participation and representation in local and federal decision-making process. So this comes to when you're talking about women's needs for housing, for healthcare, for education, for transport, the economy, all basics of empowerment. Let me use a very Malaysian example to just show you this huge disparity of women's political representation. This was super interesting for me as a journalist. The recent Sabah in East Malaysia, Sabah state elections in September 2020, only 9% of election candidates were women. And that meant there were 43 women out of, wait for it, 447 candidates. So such breathtaking lack of political will in appointing women candidates highlights the ongoing resistance to women's political leadership in the country. It also highlights ongoing discrimination and social cultural barriers that women still face within political institutions, which also runs contrary to Malaysia's international obligations and commitments. Malaysia is actually signatory and party to Article 7 on CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And Malaysia ratified this back in 1995. And part of CEDAW Article 7 that we ratified entails authorities taking all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the political life of the country. So that's where you see how there is a huge disconnect between practice and what we've actually signed on as our international duties and responsibilities. Right. So from there, let's move along a little bit to media ownership. Right. So when it comes to media ownership in Malaysia, a country of 33.5 million, and how these issues affect and interact with coverage of women's rights issues. The fact of the matter is that many media outlets in Malaysia are either owned directly by the government of Malaysia, for example, Bernama, the state broadcaster, or owned by component parties of the stronghold Barisan Nasional coalition party, which formed the government until May 2018. One example is the Media Prima Group, which is owned by, of course, the United Malays National Organization. So what this type of concentrated media ownership means is there is eventually an enforced media monopoly. It results in the formation of one gigantic conglomerate, which controls the majority of the market. Now, this, interestingly, combines with a host of repressive legislation. We have 34 laws and sub-laws at last count, which restrict media freedom in Malaysia. This includes Printing Presses and Publication Act, the PPPA, Petition Act, Official Secrets Act, and Communications and Multimedia Act. So moving a little bit deeper then, from there, let's touch on how patriarchal norms from politics to society affect Malaysians due to how and why media covers issues. It's time now, I think, to acknowledge that the Global Media Monitoring Project, GMMP's latest report, highlighted that 73% of management roles in media globally are occupied by men, compared to only 27% by women. So when you're already dealing with a deeply patriarchal society, this means media goes on to absolutely amplify and reflect stereotypes and biases against women, rather than rectify them due to who makes the final call for stories leaving every newsroom in the country. That Malaysia, furthermore, also has a mixed legal system, which includes common law, Islamic law, and customary law. And this further complicates issues of sensitivity and results in a lack of progressive reporting on women's issues, such as domestic violence, even polygamy, adultery, child marriage, etc. Right. So from here, so now let's look at, now that we've set the landscape for Malaysia and how those things possibly also relate to the lack of media coverage around ASEAN for women's rights issues, let's look at the role of media in achieving gender equality. So first and foremost, we've got legacy media versus online media. And I think in our increasingly digitalized societies around Southeast Asia, this is such a huge concern. So Malaysia, statistics from Malaysia show that we have upwards of 80% of the population online, digitalized, spending anywhere between 2 to 7 hours exclusively on their social media feeds. So that's a lot of exposure, but what does it mean when it comes to media and gender stereotypes? And even legacy media now, for survival's sake, they've actually gone online. So you're basically transferring age-old stereotypes that used to perhaps exist exclusively via television, certain radio channels perhaps, or even newspapers, and now you've digitalized that. So instead of a newspaper that perhaps reached, let's say, 50,000 readers in a day, you now have perhaps 50,000 unique views within an hour online. So think about what that means when it comes to the multiplying of gender stereotypes and biases, right? So going back to the GMMP that I had just quoted, data also shows that women only make up 24% of the persons heard, read about, or seen in newspaper, television, radio news. So mainstream media truly does assist rather than desist from traditional social and cultural norms and attitudes. And even worse, 46% of news stories, they reinforce this gender binary, this gender stereotypes, and only 4% of stories clearly challenge gender stereotypes. So which is what we're hoping will be the outcome of this masterclass in particular, that each one of you joining and participating will actually put the thought into creating gender progressive journalism and media stories, right? So all of the above, you can also see the fact that 46% of news stories are sexist, 4% are only for gender positive. We clearly see this displayed in our digital microcosm, our social media channels, right? Open up Malaysian Twitter, Malaysian Facebook any day, every day. And I'm quite sure it's the same if you're in Philippines, if you're in Thailand, and you're going to see a host of incendiary conversations, comments, and arguments which will uphold harmful gender stereotypes. I think it's also important to think about our role as journalists when we come across such content. Perhaps I'm definitely not recommending you engage in a direct flame war with whoever is making these comments or posting them, but think about what in the headline or the story that everyone is responding to was so deeply patriarchal that such a response was elicited from the audiences. I think that's where ethical journalism, that's where gender progressive, good journalism comes into play, right? So moving along from there to gender progressive journalism and newsroom leadership. There is actually right now, at this point, 2021 casting on 2022, still in the midst of a lethal global pandemic, with people spending more and more time online, consuming entertainment, consuming news media. It's a huge opportunity for media to take a steering role through gender progressive journalism. However, I must caution that this can happen only when newsroom leadership is also gender diverse and actually representative. So there's also a need for gender sensitized copy editors at each newsroom to sign off on each day's news coverage. And by and large, you will see that in Malaysian media, the outlets, particularly the online outlets, which cover gender-based issues, even if they don't quite have the sensitization that this is a gender lens, they have a copy editor, generally a woman, perhaps one who has a bit of a gender lens, and that actually results in far less snafus on the daily. And also, newsrooms can work actively to address sensationalization, sexualization of headlines and content, and ensure news items actually analyze issues with a gender lens rather than just report. I'll give you a couple of examples here. So remember what I mentioned just a little bit earlier about the huge disparity for male and female representation in Malaysian Parliament? Well, here are a couple of gems from a couple of our Malaysian male MPs or members of Parliament. A certain Shabuddin Yahya, he said girls as young as 9 were physically and spiritually ready for marriage. As the Muslim majority Southeast Asian country, Malaysia, when we passed the law on sexual offences against children without criminalizing child marriage. This issue was just reported. It wasn't analyzed, it wasn't investigated, and without that, it sort of hangs as a statement which society, by and large, condones. So that's the problematic area. Give you another one. Another MP, a certain Abdul Aziz Abdul Rahman, told female MP Kasturi Pato, who also happens to be the only Malaysian Indian female MP in the whole of Malaysian Parliament, to put on powder as he could not see her, alluding to her skin tone in an offensive and discriminatory manner. Once again, the issue was merely reported by news outlets by and large. It took the citizens themselves, Malaysians on Twitter, Malaysians on Facebook, the MP in question herself, speaking up about why it was so discriminatory, why it was such a sexist, discriminatory statement. But actually, that can be the function of news media. Take the lead, right? So there is, of course, as also Danny did mention earlier, there's a huge need for media organizations to thus conduct regular gender awareness training. So journalists, editors, managers, regardless of their own gender, have this lens which they proactively use in the news that they produce. And this moves on into production of news where there is a lack of female experts shaping public debate. So data shows only 1 in 5 experts interviewed by media are women. This translates into something I like to call, and it's a pretty popular term, a manel. a male-only panel or male-only spokespersons for all hard news issues. When we talk about hard news, of course, we mean politics, to religion, business, technology, science, environment. So in general, these hard issues are reserved for manos or male-only spokespersons and panels. And women, on the other hand, they will be covering primarily soft news issues such as lifestyle, education, beauty, wellness, childcare, motherhood, i.e., more nurturing topics that just further uphold that gender binary, right? It's the manner in which, if you see female politicians or perhaps female corporate leaders being interviewed, you will find the question that perhaps irks me most as a broadcaster. They will always be asked, how do you manage family? Have you ever asked a male spokesperson or a male politician that? Bear in mind, most of them are married, most of them do have their own families. So there you go. That's another little quick insight into how you can flip the script, particularly as a working journalist. Don't ask sexist questions, right? So outside of news media also, I must emphasize that the strict gender binary, it continues with women frequently portrayed in stereotypical, hypersexualized roles in advertising, film industry. This also has long-term social consequences. And when you have such exposure to stereotypical gender portrayals and this clear gender segregation, of course, it will eventually result in the audience preferring gender-appropriate media content, and their traditional perceptions of the gender roles, occupations becoming even more entrenched, and their attitudes and expectations towards how they react to gender discrimination in society. So here comes in media's responsibility towards gender-sensitive reporting. And this can actually be done by challenging traditional social and cultural norms and attitudes in the work which is produced. Also, media organizations need to walk the talk, have women in leadership roles, have women as experts on a diversity of topics on a daily basis, not as an exception, not just on International Women's Day or on IDABO, International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, not just during Pink October or breast cancer awareness. Have it throughout the year, have it regularly, and if that's not in your little black book as a journalist, as an editor, well, it's time to change, time to move up. But we've also got some great little websites like 50/50 that collate women experts and women speakers in Malaysia at least. And I'm sure that there are other initiatives happening on the ground, even though they are pretty recent, which once again points to the fact that these are not institutional actions, but something which has happened as a grassroots movement, because there is a huge need to be able to highlight the female experts that we are already producing, that we already have, who are already out there publishing, speaking, and advocating, but yet not given much of a space in media. So I wanted to also briefly touch here upon one of the talk shows that I produced and anchored, which was on Bernama TV, the Malaysian state broadcaster. It was called Chivasamina. And I was executive producer as well as the anchor for 50 episodes of this talk show, which focused on exclusively women. So only female spokespersons. Okay, so of course, in light of the manner in which Malaysian media and the landscape is shaped, I was often accused of, hey, how come you're not representing men? So that brings up really interesting questions. Remember what I told you about the statistics that women only form up about 24% of all representatives or voices heard or seen in media? There you go. So there is a need for not just more female-centric programming, but more programming that normalizes women's issues as part of the broader agenda for progressiveness in society. You cannot divorce the two. You cannot just be having, for example, a Tehmina special on breast cancer awareness month or day. It doesn't work that way. Women's issues, as well as how they impact the rest of society and how the rest of society impacts us, continue on relentlessly throughout the year. So let's move along from there to the next slide. Now, moving deeper into COVID-19, women's rights, and the media. There have been, of course, deep impacts on women's rights and gender equality with the fact that if we do not also address these deep fissures that have been exposed by the pandemic recovery is honestly going to be impossible for all of society. There's sharp economic and social inequalities. They have widened an already existing gap. The World Economic Forum's Global Gender Report Gap of 2021 estimates that we've actually stepped back a rough average of 39 years due to the pandemic when it comes to gender equality. Increases in abuse, violence, exploitation faced by women, girls, they're seen during any healthcare crisis. It's been observed during the Ebola outbreak some time ago, and now also during COVID. And however, during COVID, it's a much more far-reaching global and, of course, regional concern. Health systems, which have been overwhelmed by COVID. On the other hand, this has also resulted in collateral damage to women's health. Many countries have also failed to keep sexual and reproductive health services available. So this has resulted in neglect and an increase in risk to women's health. In Malaysia, for example, we continue to see women's NGOs still not classified as essential services since the first COVID lockdowns that we experienced in March 2020. And this, of course, affects women's need to escape domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and even state-run sexual and reproductive health and rights clinics, which are here run by an organization called LPPKN. They provide family planning, pregnancy termination where necessary. They were also closed during the MCO. Civil society, of course, protested this, especially in relation to SRHR access for lower income women or B40 women, as we classify them in Malaysia. And this brings us to the factor, the undeniable one, that the pandemic has actually had a confluence with women's unpaid care work. And this, of course, increased significantly as a result of school closures and increased needs of older people. However, when it comes to mainstream media, there is a huge lack of awareness that this is actually happening. But just log on to any social media feed and have a look at what women are talking about, women professionals, women academics, women who are homemakers. All they will be speaking about in the last 22 odd months is the huge burden of unpaid care work. And the only organizations that in general are talking about this is think tanks and research programs. And they publish a report. The media covers it just as what has been published without any analysis, without any further investigative approaches, and it remains static. So that's what I mean when I said that it takes gender sensitization on an organizational and editorial level to change the approach that we have to women's rights concerns, especially during a pandemic. So all of these issues, they not only include domestic violence, unpaid care burden, but also women's unemployment. A lot of the sectors that women work in, not just in Malaysia, but of course in Southeast Asia, such as hospitality, retail, they are the ones which have been most deeply impacted by pandemic closures, right? There's also the fact that women more commonly work with infection risk and high contact occupations, such as, of course, the fact that nurses in most countries are overwhelmingly female. 80 to 90% nurses are female. So, of course, imagine the COVID risk that they have. Then, of course, there are other COVID-related factors, such as poverty and marginalization. So when it comes to all these issues, once again, it goes back to news organizations taking the lead and media actually covering them and contextualizing how it impacts lived realities, not just reporting. Right. Moving on from there into the other hugely important factor of online gender-based violence, or GBV, which is something that has escalated over the pandemic. Just as I mentioned a few times already, the fact that we spend a lot more time on our devices online. So what happens in societies where there is very little sensitization around not just gender roles, but also how to interact in a healthy, respectful manner? Well, there's a lot of hate speech, unwanted sexual remarks, non-consensual posting of sexual media, threats, doxing, cyberstalking, harassment, gender-based discriminatory memes, posts, and this is the type of environment that women, in particular, women who have public figure profiles face when they interact online over the pandemic. There's also a very minimal coverage of the socio-economic impacts on women, going back once again to some of the marginalizing factors. For example, gender responsive budgeting, which can actually help to address some of the most core needs with regards to domestic violence. We only saw that seeded by international organizations and by a couple of sensitized MPs, whereby it is actually the role of the fourth estate, of journalism, of media, to take on the mantle and to understand how to approach pandemic recovery as a budgeting issue, but in a more gender sensitized manner. So there's a need for a solutions journalism approach, not just reporting. Right. So moving along here into the next slide now. Women media workers and the unequal pandemic. There are quite a few factors, and I recently did complete a research report, and I'm taking these markers from there. Personal health and safety was deeply impacted, particularly when it came to the earlier part of the pandemic and vaccine rollout, which were actually delayed. And even for journalists, journalists were not prioritized initially, unlike Indonesia, where actually journalists were prioritized and they were amongst the first to be vaccinated, considering, as they rightfully are, frontline workers, particularly reporters, photojournalists, and camera persons. So we did not have that in Malaysia, and that definitely impacted not just the personal health and safety, but also the mental health, because when it boils down to it, we all go back to our homes, we all go back to within our communities. Our homes, our communities may also involve those we are living with who are high risk, and not being vaccinated definitely had a huge impact. And we also do know of many journalists who have fallen ill with or have even passed on due to COVID. Then again, there comes in the gendered analysis on unpaid care and domestic work during COVID-19. If I mention this for women by and large in Malaysia and Southeast Asia over the pandemic, of course, the same was true for journalists and media workers. So particularly with regards to journalists whom I spoke to in Sabah and Sarawak, unpaid care and domestic work completely shot up, with some of them actually forced to take on much smaller roles at work, because just imagining the pace of the average newsroom and how that's actually escalated all the way up to the ceiling over the pandemic, with so many different portfolios to juggle, it's become very difficult for women in media to have a career trajectory that is uninterrupted if you are if you have children and if you have additional domestic labor responsibilities. So increasingly, I think we have also seen media, particularly current affairs desks, becoming more of a young, child-free woman's game. And this is, of course, disturbing because there is a huge loss of talent. There is an inability of media organizations to retain female talent once they choose to perhaps get married or start their own families. Moving on from there, the other factor is also, once again, online gender-based violence against women journalists. I'll give you a personal example when it comes to this. I generally used to tweet in both Bahasa Malaysia as well as English. However, despite the far increased levels of traction that you get when you tweet in Malay, I also face a lot more gender-based violence. I am not just a woman, I am a double, triple minority as a half Malaysian, migrant. So there are many intersections, and that's what I personally face. But so I actually did stop tweeting in Bahasa Malaysia, and I almost exclusively tweet these days in English, because it just reduces the risk. It reduces the stress of having to see literally like a few hundred bot-like accounts jump onto what you have said, because you have said something in support of, or you have produced or done work with regards to women's rights. So this sort of online GBV does seriously impact female journalists' rights to freedom of expression, as well as their ability to perform their jobs well. Then you've got the added dimension of workplace sexual harassment and gender discrimination. So in 2018, the Institute of Journalists Malaysia actually did have a quick survey done, which found out that from all the journalists who were surveyed who had faced sexual harassment, all who were women, which was 9 out of roughly 21, actually dropped completely out of the media industry. So these are just a couple more of the types of discrimination faced by women, particularly when they work in media and because of COVID-19. Let's very quickly go into the road ahead, which is just a summation and my last slide before we end. So of course, media has got to lead the struggle for women's rights. We need coherent policies, rules, mechanisms from national media policies like gender reporting guidelines to media industry self-regulation, an ombudsman or perhaps even a Malaysian media council. Safety of female media workers will of course be a key to a progressive media landscape, and that can come through organizations being far more sensitized and also realizing that you cannot cover women's rights without having enough women represented in the media. Thank you so much for listening in so far to my keynote session.